Hello and welcome to Section 2, Implement Attacking with the Vehicle Unit NPC. In this section, we'll create a grenade projectile actor blueprint. We'll also implement a user interface for attacking with the grenade. And finally, we'll implement our vehicle units attacking using the grenade projectile we create. Video 1, Creating and Implementing an Actor Blueprint of a Grenade Weapon Projectile. What we'll learn in this video is we're going to create an actor blueprint that's going to house our grenade. We're going to add components to that blueprint, including a sphere mesh component and the projectile movement component. And then we're going to implement the logic for our grenade using timers so that we can have the grenade detonate on impact or detonate after 1 second. So we need to do all of this in a new blueprint. So inside of our Content Top-Down BP Blueprints folder, let's create a new blueprint class. Get an actor class, and let's just call it BP_grenade. Nice and simple. Let's go ahead and open up our grenade. Once it appears on screen, let's go ahead and pull it up to the top so we can see everything. I like to have my details panel on the bottom left, so I'm going to tuck that over here. So we get a nice large view here. Now, what we're going to want to do first is add two components to this blueprint. First, we're going to want to add a sphere component. Now, what this actually is really not a sphere component. It's actually a static mesh component that's pre-filled with a sphere that comes as part of the engine content. Let's go ahead and call this our grenade mesh. And the other component we want to add is we want to go ahead and add a projectile movement component. Search for projectile. So projectile movement, this is what's going to give us the actual movement for our projectile. So we'll set that up in a moment. There's a very important thing though, the projectile movement component actually updates the root component of the actor that it's in. So we actually don't want to update this scene. It's actually going to be a little more performant we actually don't want to update the scene root. We actually want to update the static mesh component directly. So I'm going to drag this up to make it our new root. So we have a single root here for our grenade mesh. Now what that lets us do is make sure that we actually only have one component there at the root and not a parented relationship, because we don't need their parented relationship. So we'll just have a little less overhead there. Now let's go ahead and set up our projectile movement. So this component lets you do a lot of things with projectiles, and we're not going to cover nearly everything that you can do with it. But what we're going to do is change one setting, which is the velocity setting. Now by default, velocity is x of 1, y0, z0, which means you'll have a very slow velocity along your x-axis. One thing to note is there is a section up a little higher, we went past it, in projectile initial speed and max speed. If these are non-zero, then the velocity really just indicates a direction that you want the projectile to go when it's spawned. But if these speeds are left at 0, which we're going to leave them at 0, then the velocity actually becomes not only the direction, but also the magnitude of the velocity that you want the projectile to partake when it is spawned. So we're going to change this to 2500 along x, so give our projectile a good amount of speed when it gets spawned. And that's the only thing we need to change for our projectile movement. So let's go ahead and compile and save. Now before we go any further, we do want to go back to our grenade mesh and modify a couple of its settings for collision. So inside collision, the first thing is we want simulation generates hit events. We want that to be checked because we're going to need to check if this mesh hits something in the game world, and that will trigger us actually detonating the grenade and causing some damage. And we also want to actually uncheck generate overlap events because we're not going to be concerned with this component overlapping anything, so we don't need to worry about generating those events. And the last thing we want to do is we want to, and this actually may be hidden for you, so you may actually only see these options here for collision. If you do, hit this little down arrow for the advanced section. We want to uncheck can ever affect navigation. The reason we want to do that is we don't want this component this mesh component, if it ever hits the ground where our nav mesh is, we don't want to actually modify that nav mesh at all. because we know that this grenade is going to be detonating immediately, and there's no reason for it to modify or affect the navigation system at all. So once we've made those tweaks to the collision settings, go ahead and click Compile and Save. And let's pop over into our event graph. There's a couple nodes already preset in here. We want to actually delete the bottom two, the event tick and the event actor overlap, actor begin overlap. We don't need those, so we'll delete them. So what we're actually going to do now is we're going to make use of timers to be able to set up our grenade so that when it is spawned, it will stick around for a second, or it will detonate itself if it hits something. But we need to have a timer to know, okay, have we reached that 1 second yet, to know if we've basically run out of basically a time-based range is what we're adding here. So what we actually want to do is we want to come off of event begin play, and we want to search for set timer, and we want set timer by event. And then we want to set the time to 1.0 for 1 second. And then what we want to do is we want to make a custom event for detonating our grenade. So we're going to right click over here and search for a custom event. Misspelled custom. There we go, custom event. And we're going to name this just detonate grenade. Now the reason we're making this a custom event is that we want to be able to call this code from this timer. So the reason we're making this an event is because we have this little red box called a delegate, an output delegate. So what this allows us to do is actually drag this in to our timer here. And now this event was what will be fired when this timer runs out. If we were to make this a function, we couldn't as easily set up this timer. So that's why we're making it an event. Okay, so now what we have is when the 1 second timer runs out, we're going to detonate our grenade. That's great, but we have two things we want to have happen, and we'll implement detonate grenade in a minute. But we want not only when our timer runs out, we also want our grenade to detonate when it hits something. So if you'll remember on grenade mesh, our grenade mesh component here, we told it to simulate hit events. So let's actually scroll down in its details panel to find the on component hit. Go ahead and add that event. So when this event happens, we want this event to go through and be what happens when our component actually hits something. So this is when our grenade actually runs into something in our game world. Then we can go ahead and trigger detonate on our grenade. However, we don't want our grenade to detonate twice, so we can't just tell this to go ahead and detonate our grenade, because if we told this to detonate our grenade and the grenade hits something before the timer runs out, then the timer would also tell it to detonate, and then we would get 2 detonations, which means double the damage applied and double the particle effects, which is not what we're wanting. So the nice thing about these timers is these return values, these are timer handler structures, so we can actually take these handlers and do some cool things with them. So this handle, we can actually tell it to pause the timer. So we can say pause timer by handler. So what this means is whenever we hit something now, we're actually going to open. I drug out from it. It auto-connected from here. So actually, if we Alt or Option click to undo that, we actually want this to be called from here. So what's going to happen here is using this return value, which is this handle, we're going to tell this timer to pause whenever we hit something. That way, we're not going to have this timer call our detonate grenade event when we're about to call it when something gets hit. So now we can actually drag from here and just search for detonate, and we'll get detonate grenade. So this is our base setup here. Is again when we start playing the game, we'll have, or when it's not really when we start playing the game. It's when for this grenade the game starts playing. It gets spawned into the level. We'll set this timer for 1 second, and if we hit something, we'll pause the timer and detonate the grenade. But if we never hit anything, then after 1 second, we're just going to detonate the grenade. So this is a nice little setup to do a little bit of a time-based range for this particular grenade. Now I need to implement actually detonating the grenade. So what we're going to do is down here, we are going to, the first thing, it's a little counterintuitive, but the first thing we're going to do is actually hide our grenade. So we're actually going to say set actor hidden in game, true. Now, why are we doing this? That's because we are about to do two things with our grenade after this. We're going to apply some damage. We're going to use the damage system in UE4 to do that. And then we're also going to spawn a particle effect to show a explosion. Now, this grenade is going to be moving very, very fast. So when we tell it to detonate the grenade, from the time we tell it to detonate the grenade to actually applying some of this damage, there is a possibility that we can go another frame and appear to move a little further than when our emitter for our particle effect and our damage is coming from. So what we actually do is go ahead and hide the actor. So we're like, okay, it's going away, it's hiding, then I don't have it kind of hanging around, possibly not matching up with my damage location or my particle effect. So we're going to go ahead and hide it first. Then we're going to need to grab the location of our grenade mesh. I'm going to drag out a reference to it, and we're going to get our world location. And we're going to use this vector. We're going to use that vector as the origin point for applying what's called radial damage. So this is our damage system. This is part of the damage system in Unreal Engine 4. One thing to note, this icon here means that this is an authoritative function, which means that this function will only run on a server in a multiplayer environment. We're not doing multiplayer in this tutorial, but I just wanted to mention what that means. So we're going to now have to set up a little bit about our radial damage. So the first thing we want to do is that we want to go ahead and set up a couple variables. So the first variable is a damage amount variable in base damage. Let's go ahead and actually right click on this and say promote to variable, and let's rename this. Instead of name var0, let's press the F2 key on the keyboard. We're going to set this to our damage amount, and then let's hit compile so we can get access to the default value for this, and we'll go ahead and set it to 300. Now we're getting an error message, and that's to be expected, and that's because we have not given the radial damage node here an origin point to tell it where the damage is originating from. So we need to do that by dragging this vector in, because we want the origin for this radial damage to be where the grenade is when we're detonating it. Let's also set our damage radius, right click that and promote that to a variable so we can easily change this later. And let's rename this variable just blast radius. I'm going to actually set the blast radius to a pretty high value, mainly just to make sure that we can easily see what this works, what this looks like and that it's working. So we're going to set it to 512. If you want to set it to a lower value once you kind of play around and see what this looks like when it's working, feel free to do that. Let's go ahead and compile and save. You can see that our error has gone away the last time we compile because we've given an origin point. And close the error window. Now the two other things that I want to set here are some settings that one is just an extra thing that kind of comes along with this is who caused this damage. So we're not going to do anything with this actually in this tutorial course, but I want to go ahead and mention what it is. So this is a way to basically have a reference passed along with this damage application so that something that receives the damage can know what actor actually gave it the damage. So we're just going to get a reference to self. So we're actually just going to get a reference to self. And this reference will just pass along a reference to this particular actor saying, well, this is the actor that has caused the damage. Then the other thing we're going to do is this damage prevention channel. So what this does is anything that happens to be behind something that responds to this channel actually won't receive damage. So this is a good way to implement a cover system. This is kind of where that comes into play. We're actually going to change this to world static. So that way if something happens to be behind a static object or a world static object, then it's going to not get damage. And you can kind of play around with how that affects your gameplay if you want to. So that will actually apply the radial damage. So what this does is finds an origin point and a radius, and then applies a base damage to everything that it finds in that radius that is not in the ignore actors list, and also it does a line trace from that location from the origin to the hit actor to say, well, is there anything in the way and if there's anything in the way that prevents damage, then it'll prevent that damage. So now that we have the apply radial damage, which is great, but we need really a visual component to this. So the visual component is a particle effect. Now, we don't have any particle effects in our project right now, but there is a really nice explosion particle effect inside of the content examples that come with the engine. So let's go ahead and click compile and save. And let's go ahead and add those to the project. So if we go back to our map tab, if we go to add new, there's an add new feature or content pack. So I'm going to add a new content pack. And if we go to content packs, there is the starter content. Now, one thing to note, I am going to add this to our project. This does add roughly 800 megabytes of content to your project. There's a lot of stuff in here. So if you have downloaded the code files that come along with this course to follow along, I have not put all of these assets in those code files. Only what's actually needed to complete the content of this course. So if you want to actually go ahead and add this again, that's fine. It'll add to a new location and you'll be able to get access to everything. So let's go ahead and click add to project. It's going to go ahead and import that. This will take just a moment. Okay, now it's added everything in. So we can go ahead and close this out. You can see there's a whole bunch of things. This is an architecture, there's a bunch of static meshes. But what we want is the particle effect that's going to be in here. So let's go back into our grenade. And after we have applied our damage, we are now going to spawn emitter at location. And the location we want is actually this location. So a little trick, you can double click on a wire to get a new node. And I'm going to actually come kind of down, grab another reroute node, and come around. That way I'm kind of not going through the middle of this node, so I can kind of still see what's going on. So there, looks nice. So the reason we want to get this exact same location is we want to make sure that the particle effect is at the same origin point as where we've applied the radial damage, so they line up nicely. So the emitter we're going to go for, the emitter template is P explosion, and the P stands for particle effect. So there's the explosion. And we can actually go take a look at this really quick, what this looks like. It's a nice explosion effect. See, it's got a little bit of smoke, got some light it gives off. So it's a really, and some shrapnel. It's a really nice effect. Go ahead and close that. So that's going to spawn at that location right after we've applied damage. And then after all of that, we can actually go ahead and destroy this actor. Because this grenade has done its job, it has blown up and applied some damage, and now it is destroyed. So go ahead and click compile and save. And that's actually it for implementing our grenade. And we can actually really quickly test this out by just dragging it into our level and watching it fly across our level and run into something and blow up. So if we go into our top-down BP folder, pardon me, went one too far, top-down BP, blueprints, then we will go and find our BP grenade. So let's actually drag this into our level and just drop it right here. You know, one thing we do notice, this is a really, really big grenade. So let's actually really quickly modify the scale for this, because that's a pretty big grenade. So maybe it needs to be about 25% that size. So let's go back into our grenade blueprint, into our grenade mesh, and we can just change the scale of this to just 0.25 all around. And that should make it quarter the size. That looks a little better. So now it's a little smaller. It's not as large of a thing flying around. Now if we go and click on our local here, we can see that we have X is forward, so it's actually going to fly forward and should run into this block here. Let's see if that's kind of in line to do that. Yep. Okay, so if we actually go ahead and play our game, we'll see our grenade will fly through the air and hit this block and explode. So we actually go ahead and hit play here, and it will fly through the air and hit the block and explode, and that was really fast. So what I'm going to do is actually slide this grenade. That was really fast, so I'm actually going to slide this grenade over a little bit so that it's going to fly hopefully through the stairs, past the stairs, and we'll see it flying through the air, and nope, blew up over here. So it's flying really fast right now, which is what we want. But you can see that it is flying through the air and exploding. So that is the end of this video. We've made this grenade. Now in the next couple videos, what we're going to do is we're going to implement a user interface to be able to tell our units to attack, and then we're going to implement using this grenade with our vehicle so that we can launch our grenade at our enemies.